What is the relationship between lines and curves? All right, that is the question today. That's the question for number 132 on the list of the 144 fractal faculties of the Tree of Life. If you would like to get a full listing of all 144 of those fractal faculties for free, just leave your name and email in the comment section. I'll send that out to you. You can also check out my video for some background. It's called Tree of Life, an Introduction, just enough to get you, to the point where you can follow along with all 144 of these videos. You want to go a little deeper, you can send me $10 on Venmo or Cash App, and I'll send you a copy of my book called The Mass Tree. It's only 65 pages. You could probably get through it in a day, but you can get quite a bit more information about each one of the spheres on the tree and how the contextual information. It just helps you if you're interested in studying up on the tree. It's a great start. My approach on the tree is quite a bit different than anybody else's, although it's derived from some definite sources, but got a little of my own touch in there. So, okay, now what we're looking at today is number 132. Now, just keep in mind that the Tree of Life itself is more or less, for the purposes of this at least, is a map of our consciousness. And, when you make a map, you're basically taking a, 3 or more dimensional reality and you're projecting it onto a 2-dimensional surface. So you have to use your imagination a little bit and, imagine that these are not so much circles as spheres. You also, probably would like to imagine that this whole thing is rotating in both directions at the same time. And therefore, either one of these pillars can be on either side. It could be flipped, and it kind of depends on your state of mind. Okay, now each one of these circles or spheres, if the tree is a map of our consciousness, each one of these circles or spheres is an aspect of our consciousness, or a faculty of our consciousness, an ability of our consciousness. And today, when we're looking at number 132, we're looking here at the first sphere. Now, there are 12 different faculties of consciousness, numbered all the way from 10 all the way to 1, or to 0. This is 1, this is 0. Above the tree, there's also an abyss here, which is not numbered. Okay, so a total of 12, and we're looking at the top of the tree to number 1. Number 1, so what faculty of consciousness is number 1? Well, it is one of our 3 divine faculties, the faculties that we share, although not in kind, but not in quantity, with the divine, the creator of the universe. 3 here is omnipotence, all-powerful. 2 is omniscience, all-knowing or wisdom. And 1 is omnipresence, all-present, everywhere at once, eternally. So the first sphere is all present everywhere at once, eternally. And the way we think about this is basically, it's an underlying reality. It's our higher self at our deepest center. And but the only way that we can really tap into this underlying reality is if we are able to kind of discard all the overlying stuff that drowns out this very subtle motion. The other motions that comprise the overlying are, prevent us from digging in deeper and getting to our deepest center, our higher self. So we have to be able to calm our mind and our emotions to the point where this other thing emerges, everything else falls away, and this first sphere emerges. You can think of this also as an ether underlying or subsisting, all pervasive. You can think of it as an underlying geometry that is kind of like a grid, of connections. And we find that when we are able to sink in to our deepest center and become one with the first sphere, we are able to recognize that what is at our deepest center, our higher self, is the exact same higher self that's at the center of everything else. So we're connected with everything else. We're all part of one being. The whole universe is one being. It seems like an infinitude of beings, but that's because we're not at that deepest center. If we can get to the deepest center, we recognize that we are all one. And so it's a unifying factor as well. So that's kind of the short version on the first sphere. But the first sphere is just one of our 12 faculties, major faculties of consciousness. Now, to get from 12 to 144 fractal faculties, what we're doing is we're taking the tree to the second power. So we're multiplying 12 by 12 to get 144. And, as far as that whole process is represented by taking the whole tree and shrinking it down to the size of just one sphere and then applying it to each sphere. Okay, so we break down this sphere into the seventh sphere into its 12 parts. We break down the fourth sphere into its 12 parts, according to the tree. So it has a mini 10th sphere, a mini 9th sphere, a mini 8th sphere, a mini 7th sphere, or a fractal 10th, 9th, 8th, and 7th sphere. Fractal or fractional or just mini are all really talking about the same thing. So when we're talking about the first sphere, we see that we imagine that there is a whole tree superimposed here on the first sphere. And number 132 on the list corresponds to the 0 fractal within the first sphere. So there's a 0 fractal here at the top or above the first sphere. What does that 0 correspond to? Well, the 0, if the first sphere is everything, the all, everything in the universe, the 0 sphere is nothing in the universe, meaning that it is not in the universe, and that it does not exist. But it's still relevant to us because it doesn't exist in our universe, but it exists in the Creator. So it is the first sphere. So this is the part of the first sphere that we're not privy to. Kind of like the first sphere's private life, or the first sphere's, when it's not at its day job, then it's here at the 0. When it's at its day job, we see it, operating, but it has a separate existence that we don't know anything about. And that's the 0 sphere. You can think of it as the emotional state of, this is Oser, the higher in the Egyptian, or the higher self, the emotional state of Oser, which is no emotions. So those are all things that you can think about with the 0. As we'll talk about today, it's also what you would call this is the first ether, the underlying ether. But this is actually also an ether, the 0, the ether. And this ether even underlies the ether of the first sphere. And so, this is kind of an impenetrable mystery as well. So zero sphere also corresponds to mystery. And we will be combining those two aspects to get to number 132, which is called closest packing of spheres, or invisible duality. Stage number 132 is about the first and the 0th ethers, which are the isotropic vector matrix, IVM, and the closest packing of spheres, the CPS. The progression of the natural in the reciprocal system, these are known as the progression of the natural reference system, and the rotational base. And those are the progression is the equivalent of nothing, and the rotational base is the rotational equivalent of nothing. The 0th ether, the closest packing of spheres between subjective and objective, the infinite time-conditioned plane wherein things dwell, invisible duality. It's two things, but we can't see either of them. In the subjective, creation is preceded by the Supreme Being bringing itself into manifestation. At first, there was nothing. Then nothing turned itself inside out and became something. Inside outing, binary ethers, ones and zeros, straight and curved. The isotropic vector matrix uses exclusively straight lines, and the closest packing of spheres is exclusively curved surfaces. And you get from the closest packing of spheres to the isotropic vector matrix, the duality of the hidden invisibility, straight line and circle, 1 and 0. In multi-dimensions, they are ethers, IVM and CPS, non-visibility, imperceptibility. The 0th ether is the closest packing of spheres, which are a gaggle of identical spheres of no particular size, but they're all the same size, packed together under pressure conditions that are identical in all directions. Connect the centers of each sphere. So you take all those different spheres and connect the centers, and then we have the isotropic vector matrix, the first ether. So if you got all those spheres all put together, and you connect their centers, that makes the isotropic vector matrix. So you have the 0th ether and the first ether. Here we can see how curved surfaces of the closest packing of spheres originate and underlie the straight lines of the isotropic vector matrix. Curved and straight, IVM, CPS. The self becomes aware that it is an immaterial, non-physical reality that cannot be perceived, but can be pictured as binary, invisible ethers, underlying everything in the universe. Two ethers, or binary ethers. The self is the first ether, and the non-self is the second, or is the 0th. Unconditioned is the 0th. Both imperceptible. 0 is the emotional state of the higher self, no emotions. The emotional state of inner peace that comes from the total unification of the individual as an invisible duality that is infinite potential. invisible duality, two reciprocal halves of one universe. I-O, first and zeroth ether. Okay, we'll have more to talk about here once we get into the section on synergetic geometry. And it's interesting that the reciprocal system talks about the same thing, but uses different terminology. When they're talking about it, they're talking about the progression of the natural reference system, which is motion in all directions at the speed of light. And that is the isotropic vector matrix. If you take a center point, when you have the closest packing of spheres, each one of the spheres is indistinguishable from each other one. Each one can be at the center. And the center point, the center ball or sphere is the center of a vector equilibrium. So the center of that ball is the center of the vector equilibrium. That's the location or the reference point that then you move in every direction at the speed of light. And that's represented by the overall vector equilibrium, which is taking that center point and moving it in one unit in 12 different directions at the same time. And those 12 different directions all end up being at the center of 12 different spheres that are surrounding that one original sphere. So each one of the vector equilibriums occupies 13 spheres. But then when you layer it, you put one layer around another layer, you discover that each one of those spheres can potentially be the center or the reference point or the location. And then there's always 12 spheres directly around that first sphere. And then there's the next layer is actually 42 spheres. So there's 12, there's one, and there's 12 around that one, and then there's 42 around that next one, and then there's 92 around that next one, and so on. So, but each one, if you end up having an infinite amount of these different spheres, each one of them can be considered to be the center. So it's like a topology, a geometrical topology where, without being given the reference point, no point is any different than any other point. You can't if you're standing on the surface of a sphere, you can't determine where you are on that surface. Every point is the same as every other point. And so that is a characteristic of the closest packing of spheres. Okay, well, again, we'll talk more about that as we go along, but that is number 132 on the list. That is the 0th fractal of the first sphere. Stay tuned, because tomorrow we'll be rolling out number 133 on this list. And again, just keep in mind that you can just leave your name and email in the comment section, and I'll send out that free copy of my the guide to the 144 fractal faculties. And if you want to put $10 into my Venmo or Cash App account listed in the description, I will send you a copy of my book called The Mass Tree. You can also, if you are feeling generous, you can just donate directly to my Cash App and Venmo listed in the description. Otherwise, just stay tuned for future videos on this channel. Thanks for tuning in, and we hope to see you soon. Have a great day.